In the spring of 1962, at a lonely racetrack called Zandvoort in the Netherlands, various teams were preparing for the first race of the 1962 Formula 1 World Championship. All of your familiar favourites were present: Ferrari with their 156 Sharknose, Cooper with their T60, the car, not the tank, and Porsche, who were not scared of F1 in these days, had their 911. No, wait, their 804. However, one team stunned the paddock by turning up with a car where even the current F1 cars can trace their routes back to. I am of course talking about Team Lotus at the 25. Designed by the legendary Colin Chapman, the Lotus 25 was like an SR71 Blackbird sat next to a Nissan Micra when it first revealed all those years ago, especially compared to its early predecessors. But why? Why did the Lotus 25 go on to compete in Formula 1 for the next 5 years and find a mountain of success along the way? Well, using Assetto Corsa, since funnily enough I don't own one of these things, we can take a look at it in action and try to discover why. If you'd like to lend me one, please email me. When I compared this to being an SR71 Blackbird to the rest of the grid being Nissan Micras, I really wasn't joking. You see, every other car on the grid was based around your bog standard space frame chassis. Not this thing though. You see, the Lotus 25 is built around an aluminium monocoque chassis, the very first car in Formula 1 history to do so. Inspired by aircraft designs, the word monocoque is the French word for single shell, so everything else is built around this shell. In fact, I would encourage all of you to build a model kit of a Formula 1 car from this era to get a good idea of how it works. After all, Adrian Newey found interest in car engineering after building a Tamiya Lotus 49 kit. Don't believe me? Then go and ask him. Really, it's true. The monocoque created a design that was strong and rigid whilst also being fairly lightweight for the time. Whilst the conventional space frame chassis would flex under load and were heavier, thus more prone to failure. The fuel tanks were also mounted inside the chassis, which were strong and flexible, which lowered the chances of a catastrophic fuel leak. This chassis created one of the slimmest F1 car designs ever seen, and the amount of space that was saved through the design created a much lower frontal area, which minimised drag overall. The slim design meant that the driver had to sit almost horizontally inside. This was previously done with the Lotus 18 from 1960 and has been the common seating position for F1 drivers ever since. It had a neat little engine too. There were no Ford DFVs at the time, but they did have the 1.5 litre Coventry Climax V8, which had an impressive power output of 200 brake horsepower. Combined with a total weight of 451 kilograms, gave birth to undoubtedly the fastest car on the grid. So we have our car, now let's find some drivers. Over its competitive history, the Lotus 25 saw many legends at the wheel, including Richard Atwood, Chris Amon and Trevor Taylor. The 25, however, is pretty much associated with only one man, Jim Clark, one of the greatest drivers of all time. So let's take a quick look as to how it did, shall we? Its debut year in 1962 saw impressive results, including its first win at Spa for the Belgian Grand Prix. Jim Clark achieved 6 pole positions out of the 9 races, but only achieved 3 victories. In the beginning, the car was fairly unreliable and encountered problems with its Climax gearbox. In fact, at the Italian Grand Prix, both Clark and Taylor had gone through all of their spare gearboxes that weekend. This led to both Drivers' and Constructors' Championships being lost to Hollywood legend Graham Hill, who was driving for British Racing Motors, or BRM for short. Despite the teething issues, Lotus and Chapman carried on with the project into 1963. This season saw only slightly better results than the previous year. What I mean by that is Jim Clark won 7 out of 10 races from 7 pole positions. And to make this victory even more sweeter, Clark only retired once, yet was still classified for the race at Monaco. His smooth and non-aggressive driving style probably helping in that regard. To put that into perspective, his Lotus teammate Trevor Taylor finished 16th in the championship, with his best finish being 6th at Monaco, which earned him his only point that year. Clark's skills were probably best shown at Belgium, where during a wet Grand Prix at Spa, he lost 5th gear from his climax gearbox after struggling with it for most of the race, where he had to hold the gear lever in place whilst driving a wet and rainy Spa one-handed. After 32 laps, he crossed the line to win the Belgian Grand Prix ahead of second place Bruce McLaren, with a gap of 4 minutes and 54 seconds. I mean, that's absolutely astonishing. That's probably one of the most impressive wins in Formula 1 history. Max Verstappen, eat your heart out. And of course, Lotus won the Constructors' Championship that year, with Jim Clark taking the crown for the drivers. By 1964, Lotus were beginning to look beyond the 25, yet the car was still the main entry for the team and favoured by Jim Clark. As the season began, Jim Clark won 3 out of the first 5 races that year before switching to the updated version of the 25, the Lotus 33. The 33 was essentially the same car, yet was fitted with an updated suspension to better suit the new wider tyres that season. In Germany and Austria, however, the 33 retired from both races with reliability issues. For Italy, Clark switched back to the 25 but again was struck down with engine issues. The rest of the season didn't fare much better in both cars, with retirements at Watkins Glen and Mexico, but luckily for Clark, he was classified at both events. Mike Spence also placed his Lotus 25 in 4th at the final race at Mexico, outscoring his Lotus teammates. Reg Parnell Racing had also purchased a couple of Lotus 25s for use in their privateer team. However, they suffered immense reliability issues throughout the season despite using a 1.5 litre BRM V8 engine. Ferrari, however, would eventually claim victory that year, with John Surtees driving the 158 or 1512, a car that on the outside looked similar to the Lotus but had differences in the overall structure of the car. This was unquestionably Ferrari's effort to catch up to Lotus, and the 25 was finally beaten. In 1965, the Lotus 25 would put on its last performances for the team as Lotus continued development on the Lotus 33 and the new incoming Lotus 43 from 1960s onwards to meet the new engine regulations. Jim Clark drove the 25 only once in the 10-race season, winning the French Grand Prix at Charade. This was the final time Jim Clark would drive the car in Formula 1. Mark Spence also drove the 25 to 8th at Zandvoort. Its final race for Lotus came at the 1965 Mexican Grand Prix at the hands of Moises Solana, who qualified in a respectable 9th but eventually retired on lap 55 with ignition troubles. This is not to say that the 25 was forgotten, however, as Reg Parnell Racing continued to use the 25 that year and managed to secure 2 points finishes at the hands of Richard Atwood in Italy and Mexico. Now you're probably thinking that would be the end of the story, but I'm afraid you're wrong, as the Lotus 25 simply couldn't get away from the circuit for long. During the 1966 Monaco Grand Prix, the car would be utilised as a camera car to shoot scenes from the 1966 John Frankenheimer Classic Grand Prix. Go and watch that if you haven't. It's arguably one of the best racing movies you will ever see. Trust me, it is just amazing. In 1967, 2 years after Lotus stopped using the car, Reg Parnell Racing entered the Lotus 25 twice during the season, now fitted with a larger 2.1 litre BRM V8 engine. Its first entry that year was at Kyalami for the South African Grand Prix, where it retired on lap 51. The life of the Lotus 25 fittingly ended at Zandvoort, the same circuit it first appeared at 4 years earlier. Chris Irwin qualified in 13th in his BRM powered machine and brilliantly drove the Lotus 25 to its final finishing position of 7th. And with that, the curtains close on the wonderful story of one of the most successful designs in Formula 1 history. The legacy of the 25 is still felt today as one of the most iconic F1 cars of all time. Its revolutionary design changed the course of motor racing history, and pretty much every F1 car since then has followed the same basic design principles that built it way back in 1962. And even in 2023, the Lotus 25 is a common sight in the historic racing scene and still remains a competitive car in those races 60 years after it was first built, which, in my opinion, is the best way you can truly honour and respect these machines, by doing what they were built for, to race. And that brings an end to a quick and simple insight into the history of one of F1's greatest cars, and I really hope you enjoyed, as I'm trying this kind of video out with plenty of cars and circuits that can be covered from both F1 and sports cars. I really appreciate you watching, and let me know in the comments what you think. If you did enjoy it, then do leave a like and subscribe if you're new. As always, stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.